The figure of Jesus riding into Jerusalem should not have been moving. And yet, last night, it did move. On the Mount of Olives, a fissure began to open across the ancient stone, advancing as if it followed an invisible line. It was not a collapse. It was not an accident. It was precise. It was unsettling. At the same time, the sky above the city turned strange. The clouds did not disperse. They remained suspended, forming figures that caused many to lift their gaze and find no words to express what they saw. The stones of ages vibrated. The air felt different. And those familiar with the scriptures recalled words set down centuries ago. Are we seeing a natural phenomenon or a signal that cannot be overlooked? Stay with me, because what took place in Jerusalem may prove far greater than one can imagine. The shift arrived without fanfare. Along a frequently traveled path on the Mount of Olives, a slender fissure appeared on the stone trail. At first, it seemed ordinary, nothing more than surface wear, brought by time, the weather, and the steady flow of people. In Jerusalem, signs of aging appear often, and most pass without notice. Yet this fissure did not remain still. Over the days that followed, it extended gradually, not in sudden or forceful fashion. What captured attention was not its scale, but its exactness. The fracture widened at a steady rhythm, following a clear line from east to west. It did not spread in chaos or break apart as erosion typically might. Instead, it held its course, heading toward zones marked by ancient stones and nearby tombs. Those familiar with the Mount of Olives began to raise questions. Natural wear usually follows the weak spots in rock or the path of water. This fracture appeared to disregard both factors. Seismic tools provided scant insight. Only the lightest of tremors, so faint they often go unreported, were noted. There were no further shocks, no steady buildup, no hints of rising activity. More striking still, the motion did not match any documented fault line in the region. Geologically, the area holds complexity shaped by systems around the Dead Sea. Yet this occurrence did not fit the common patterns of pressure or release. From a technical standpoint, no signs pointed to an earthquake on the horizon or any clear natural cause. That very absence drew the eyes. Most earthly events leave clues such as tension fractures or shifts one can measure. Here, movement came without force and change without haste. The ground displaced itself, but in an almost deliberate manner. Engineers and scholars examining footage and surface readings discovered nothing dire enough to trigger alerts, yet nothing commonplace enough to overlook entirely. It was within this realm of uncertainty that the ancient texts quietly joined the discussion. Certain observers noticed how the direction from east to west in the fissure echoed lines from the book of Zechariah, chapter 14, verse 4, speaking of the Mount of Olives divided along that same path in days yet to come. Those drawing the link remained measured in their words. No one proclaimed the mountain was cleaving apart. No one announced a prophecy realized. The mention served as background, not as verdict, a directional echo rather than an assured fulfillment. This difference carries importance. Similarity falls short of proof, and neither scripture nor logic urges haste. What stands apart is not the fissure alone, but its traits: slow expansion, steady direction, limited seismic signs, and its place amid terrain rich in history. Viewed one by one, each element might fade away. Combined, they weave a design resistant to easy answers. For the time being, the fissure remains under watch. No alerts have sounded. No areas stand closed. Daily life across the Mount of Olives flows on. Still, something has shifted. The earth has not split open, but trust in straightforward replies has. This instant calls not for fear, but for mindful presence. In a city where history teaches that profound alterations often start softly, even a modest motion in the ground suffices to pause people and invite a second look. Remain here with us, for what develops next marks the point where the pattern grows tougher to set aside. Jerusalem started to experience rainfall heavier than the season usually brings. It was not the sort of storm that gathers over time or lingers across days. Rather, the rain descended abruptly in short, intense bursts that overwhelmed drains and flooded streets along with lower paths within minutes. The swiftness stood out. Water gathered more rapidly than expected, reshaping routes and pavements before locals or authorities could respond. The flooding itself held no rarity, but the instant and intensity felt misplaced. As the water coursed through the city, another detail seized focus. Streams and runoff ways displayed odd shifts in hue. Across various spots, the water grew darker or assumed unfamiliar shades. Early accounts pointed toward stirred soil minerals or runoff blending with bare ground. Such notions clarified the manner of occurrence, but left the speed unexplained. These alterations emerged without signal and receded in equal quiet, leaving scant harm yet abundant mysteries. The unease centered less on peril than on recognition. Observers sensed this bore little resemblance to typical seasonal flows. At the same time, the warmth grew stronger. The air turned thick and weighty, pressing down instead of circulating with ease. Readings showed temperatures not at extremes, yet the atmosphere pressed oppressively. Vitality ebbed faster, concentration slipped away, and the warmth endured, particularly once rain passed, when moisture ought to have eased matters. Instead, it heightened the strain, yielding tension in place of comfort. Most of all, the heavens started acting in manners that unsettled watchers. Bursts of lightning appeared close to sites held sacred across ages, materializing absent the typical gathering of storm clouds. No heavy banks of vapor rolled, no ongoing thunder rolled forth. The strikes inflicted no harm, no blazes, no wounds, no damaged buildings. Their distinction lay in their exact placement. Lightning illuminated chosen spots for brief moments, then vanished without extension or escalation. Considered in isolation, none of these incidents defies ordinary explanation. Studies of weather account for sudden downpours. The science of substances explains variations in water tone. Trends in climate cover the building heat. States of the atmosphere address the lightning. Yet when sudden rain altered water's oppressive warmth and targeted lightning converge, the notion of mere chance starts to dissolve. Significant surfaces not via ruin, but via alignment. Jerusalem adds gravity to occasions like these. In countless other cities, such patterns might slip by unremarked. Not so here. Water warmth and firmament reacting in unison alters the way one perceives the occurrences. Individuals refrain from panic, yet they take heed. They temper their stride. They ponder not merely the events themselves, but the reason these indicators arrive as one. Such alignment announces no disaster. It discloses building pressure. And in a city whose past reveals that decisive shifts frequently originate with subtlety, that pressure by itself holds attention firm. Because once the forces of nature begin answering in concert, the inquiry shifts from whether change stirs to the direction toward which it advances. Reports emerging from Jerusalem spoke not of typical cloud formations. Across clip after clip, shapes took form in the skies that viewers described as resembling angels. Not dispersed or indistinct, but arranged with clear intent. Certain forms appeared to bear wings, while others stood upright, aligned one beside the next, as if progressing in unison. In multiple recordings, the observers pointed out shapes that seemed like riders in the sky, giving the impression of structure instead of vapor drifting at random. What drew even greater attention was the frequency with which this occurred. These were not singular moments captured once and then forgotten. Similar forms appeared again and again in different recordings from different locations and at different times. Some witnesses described the figures as bright or radiant. Others noted that the formations resembled a host, advancing not clouds driven by the wind. The shapes held their form longer than expected, maintaining distance and alignment before dissolving slowly. In many accounts, observers also described clouds forming what they believed was the image of the Lord. A dominant figure stood out clearly against the sky, separated from the surrounding layers of clouds. It did not disintegrate at once. It appeared remained long enough to be recognized and then faded gradually. Similar descriptions arose independently, adding to the sense that this was not a single shared illusion. Meteorologists pointed to rare atmospheric effects. Skeptics questioned whether artificial intelligence or digital alteration played a role. Yet no explanation fully accounted for why the shapes appeared with such clarity, repetition, and apparent coordination. The discussion remained unresolved, suspended between natural causes and technological doubt. As attention grew, a familiar passage from the scriptures began to surface quietly in conversations offered not as assertion but as context. The armies of heaven followed him, riding on white horses and dressed in fine white clean linen. Revelation 19, verse 14. Those who mentioned the verse remained careful. No declarations were made, no fulfillment was announced. The connection was visual rather than prophetic. Angels in order a leading figure forward movement. The verse served as a point of reference, not as conclusion. The question many asked was not whether angels or the Lord had appeared, but why such imagery would manifest now above Jerusalem during a time already marked by unusual changes in earth and sky. In this city, symbols never carry light weight, and images of angels in the heavens are not easily dismissed. And while the city remained watchful, the fishers held their line. It became clear that what would come next would no longer remain confined to the ground beneath their feet. What followed did not announce danger with noise or force. Witnesses in multiple districts reported a dark object suspended above the city, motionless against the sky for nearly 20 minutes. It did not descend. It did not drift. It did not rotate. There was no visible propulsion, no exhaust, and no sound. Weather conditions offered no explanation. The winds were light, the clouds moved slowly in the background, and yet the object kept its position as if fixed to an invisible point. What attracted the most attention was not panic, but the behavior. Birds approaching the area did not scatter or flee. Instead, flocks circled the object in tight, controlled patterns, wheeling deliberately, as if tracking something rather than reacting to a threat. The motion was orderly, sustained, and calm, an unusual response that contrasted sharply with normal animal behavior during aerial disturbances. While gazes remained fixed on the sky, unrelated events unfolded on the ground. In a residential area, a building collapsed suddenly without warning. There were no reports of structural instability, visible cracks, or recorded seismic activity at that moment. Residents escaped moments before the collapse, as floors gave way silently rather than violently. Engineers later confirmed the absence of common triggers, deepening the uncertainty rather than resolving it. Around the same period, concentrated lightning strikes hit limited zones throughout the city. No storm system was present, no gradual buildup of thunderclouds, and no widespread rain. The impacts were almost vertical and tightly grouped, striking confined areas before stopping as abruptly as they began. Power outages followed, but the sky quickly returned to calm. Another report added to the growing pattern. An ancient tree, deeply rooted and long considered stable, broke violently from within. There was no wind, no lightning strike, and no external impact. Witnesses described the trunk splitting outward, as if pressure had built internally before releasing in a single moment. The surrounding area remained untouched, leaving the event isolated and unexplained. Taken individually, each occurrence invited rational explanations. Objects can be misidentified, buildings can fail, lightning can behave unpredictably, trees can decay unseen. Yet these events did not arrive alone. They appeared within the same narrow period across different realms, sky structure, climate, and living matter, each breaking expected patterns without escalating into chaos. For those familiar with the scriptures, the alignment carried weight beyond mere coincidence. There will be signs in the heavens above and in the earth below. Acts 2, verse 19. The verse does not specify spectacle or destruction, only signs appearing in different realms. Jerusalem did not erupt in fear. Life resumed. The sky cleared. The ground grew still. Yet something had been briefly interrupted, as if normal patterns had paused and then continued, leaving behind a silence filled with meaning rather than answers. In the period that followed, Jerusalem presented a striking contradiction. The sky above the city remained stable and without incident, while conditions below suggested something unusual had passed. Meteorological readings showed no atmospheric disturbance, shifting pressure systems, or developing storms. By every standard measure, the sky appeared ordinary, offering no explanation for what ground-level systems began to register. Despite this calm, brief magnetic irregularities were recorded across the area. Such interference is typically linked to solar activity. However, no solar storms or space weather events were detected regionally or globally. Monitoring systems stayed clear, indicating the source of the disruption was not external, but localized and temporary. At the same time, communication networks experienced short-lived malfunctions. Navigation signals deviated slightly, phone connections dropped and restored without cause, and synchronization errors appeared in unrelated systems. These interruptions were minor, but their timing overlapped closely, suggesting coordination rather than coincidence. Infrastructure checks later confirmed no physical failures had occurred. Pilots operating above and near Jerusalem reported momentary inconsistencies in their instruments. Flight systems recorded readings that corrected themselves without intervention, leaving no lasting effect, yet enough uncertainty to be noted. No warnings were issued and no routes were altered. Still, the anomalies resisted routine explanation. Before most residents became aware of any technical issues, the animals reacted first. Dogs displayed restlessness, birds altered their movement patterns, and livestock showed brief agitation. These reactions passed quickly, but occurred without visible cause, echoing patterns seen in other unexplained events where sensitivity precedes awareness. Across the entire city, a notable silence began to spread. Public spaces grew subdued. Conversations slowed. Movement became deliberate, and the voices softened. There was no panic. There was no visible fear. Only a shared sense of attention, as if something required recognition rather than response. For those familiar with the scriptures, the moment carried a familiar echo. There will be signs in the heavens and in the earth. Luke 21, verse 25. If this analysis resonates with you, please give the video a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Subscribe and keep watching, because what followed soon moved beyond subtle signals toward an unmistakable alignment. Without warning, a hailstorm formed directly over Jerusalem, not drifting in from surrounding regions, not preceded by darkening skies or falling temperatures, but appearing fully developed above the city itself. Meteorological data later confirmed the absence of a storm front, a drop in pressure, or any atmospheric buildup that would normally signal such an event. The hailstones differed from those typically linked with seasonal storms in the region. They fell hard and fast, irregular, rather than rounded, striking roofs, streets, and terraces with unusual force. The old city absorbed the main impact. Stones that had endured centuries of conflict and weather cracked under the assault, and paths that had stayed intact for generations showed sudden damage. Among the most startling losses were the ancient olive trees, some believed to be hundreds of years old. These trees had survived wars, droughts, and harsh seasons, yet they broke abruptly under the falling ice. Witnesses described branches snapping cleanly, trunks splitting as if struck repeatedly at precise points. The speed and severity of the damage contrasted with the brief duration of the storm. Emergency teams inspecting the aftermath noticed a troubling detail. The pattern of damage did not resemble the typical destruction associated with weather. Instead of scattered impact zones, there were concentrated areas of intense force. Some responders compared the effect to seismic shock rather than precipitation. noting similarities with damage usually seen after ground tremors rather than hail. When the storm reached its peak, the electrical grid of Jerusalem flickered. Lights dimmed and restored across the multiple districts, not from prolonged outages, but in sharp, isolated pulses. Electronic systems experienced brief interruptions, coinciding closely with the heaviest hail impacts. Yet as quickly as the interference appeared, it passed, leaving the systems intact and operating normally. Then, as abruptly as it had formed, the storm ended. Within minutes, the hail ceased completely. The sky cleared. No persistent rain followed. There was no gradual weakening to mark its departure. The event concluded as decisively as it began, leaving behind damaged, stone-broken trees and a city struggling to reconcile what had just occurred. Meteorologists reviewing the data found little that aligned with known patterns. Hail of that size and intensity requires specific atmospheric conditions, none of which were present. There was no explanation for why the storm concentrated over Jerusalem, rather than dispersing across the surrounding terrain. The localized nature of the event deepened the mystery, rather than resolving it. For residents, the unsettling aspect was not only the destruction, but the timing. The storm arrived after the subtle movement of the ground, after system irregularities, after signals that had already defied normal explanation. This was not an isolated anomaly appearing out of sequence. It felt like escalation. Jerusalem had not been gradually drawn into the event. It had been struck briefly, intensely, and then released. The storm left no warning of what might come next, only the sense that something had crossed a threshold, and that what followed would no longer remain hidden. The desert does not surrender its secrets easily, and when it does, it is never without reason. In the Judean desert, where silence has preserved history for millennia, a minor tremor fractured the surface just enough to expose something no one was seeking, yet something that seemed deliberately sealed against discovery. The tremor itself was insignificant by seismic standards. It registered briefly, caused no damage, and would have gone unnoticed had it not split a section of rock near a monitored archaeological zone. When patrol teams arrived to inspect the fissure, they found more than a surface crack. A narrow opening revealed worked stone beneath the earth, its geometry unmistakably intentional. Excavation teams carefully widened the opening and uncovered a stone chamber carved and left intact for centuries. The air inside was cold and dry, preserved, as if time itself had been contained. The walls were cut cleanly from limestone, their surfaces marked not by erosion, but by tools. This was not a natural cavity. It was a constructed space, sealed and forgotten. In the center of the chamber stood a stone sarcophagus positioned with deliberate precision. It was not pushed against a wall nor buried under debris. It occupied the focal point of the room, demanding attention the moment light entered the space. The lid bore a narrow fracture, suggesting pressure from above rather than collapse from below, as if the chamber had resisted opening until a precise moment. Around the sarcophagus lay skeletal remains, arranged in a manner that immediately unsettled the investigators. The skeletons were not scattered nor resting in typical burial positions. Each one knelt facing inward, bodies angled toward the sarcophagus, hands gripping rusted swords with blades pointing directly at its center. The posture was unmistakable. These were not the dead laid to rest. They were guardians. The archaeologists found no known burial tradition in the region that matched such an arrangement. The scene suggested intention, duty, and sacrifice rather than ceremony. The positioning implied that what lay inside the sarcophagus had been deemed valuable enough or dangerous enough to warrant protection even in death. As daylight shifted across the chamber, another detail emerged. A beam of sunlight filtered through the surface fissure and fell directly onto the sarcophagus. The alignment remained consistent far longer than expected, despite the movement of shadows elsewhere in the chamber. Preliminary analysis suggested the architecture had been designed to capture light with remarkable precision, using calculations that exceeded what is commonly attributed to that era. This was not a careless discovery formed by chance. The location of the chamber, its roof or the arrangement of remains, and the alignment of light all pointed toward advanced, intentional design. Someone had planned not only its construction, but its concealment, and perhaps even the moment of its exposure. For those familiar with the scriptures, the significance was hard to ignore, because there is nothing hidden that will not be revealed. Luke 8, verse 17. The verse does not specify how or when the revelation occurs, only that concealment is never permanent. The desert had remained silent for centuries. Then, with a tremor barely strong enough to be measured, it opened just enough to speak. What distinguishes this moment from countless previous anomalies is not the intensity of any single event, but the way multiple events coexist without competing for explanation. No single occurrence demands belief on its own. Each can be examined, categorized, and temporarily set aside. Yet together, they resist dismissal, forming a pattern that feels deliberate rather than accidental. The ground moved without collapsing. The structures responded without failing in any overwhelming manner. The light behaved strangely without plunging the city into darkness. The sound appeared and faded without leaving measurable traces. Human awareness shifted subtly without panic or direction. These occurrences shared no common cause, no shared location, and no single system. Yet they arrived within the same narrow window, interacting more through timing than through any mechanical link. In most crises, escalation forces an immediate reaction. Sirens sound, crowds surge, and authorities step in. None of that unfolded here. No evacuation orders were issued, no emergency broadcasts went out, and no visible effort emerged to label the situation a disaster. Jerusalem did not empty itself, nor did it freeze in place. Instead, it continued absorbing the change rather than resisting it. Life adjusted its rhythm instead of breaking apart. This very restraint is what unsettled those watching closely. When chaos erupts, it seizes attention at once. When alignment forms in silence, it demands discernment. Observers noted that unrelated systems appeared to align with one another. Earth structure, light, sound, and perception neither clashed nor contradicted each other. They echoed. Each responded briefly, then fell quiet, as though fulfilling a shared role. Among longtime residents and scholars, this pattern carried a familiar resonance. The history of Jerusalem bears the mark of moments that arrive unannounced, where meaning precedes explanation. Prophetic traditions often describe warnings that do not shout, but whisper occasions when recognition spreads not through headlines, but through shared understanding among those attuned to the pattern rather than the spectacle. The recognition did not arrive all at once. It moved quietly from person to person among those familiar with the scriptures and with history not as certainty, but as resonance. Conversations halted mid-sentence. People lingered longer in public spaces without knowing precisely why. The city did not feel threatened. It felt attentive. What set this alignment apart was its refusal to force interpretation. Nothing demanded belief, nothing insisted on a single conclusion. The events left room to observe, to compare, to remember. In that space, many recalled prophetic warnings that stressed timing over terror sequence, over shock warnings that appear early enough to be overlooked, yet clear enough to be recognized afterward. Jerusalem has endured noisier moments, moments of fire war and collapse. Those events rewrite history in plain sight. This one did not. It settled over the city like a question rather than an answer. It declared no ending. It suggested a beginning. That distinction matters. Announcements seek reaction. Alignment invites awareness. One overwhelms, the other waits. And in a city where history has taught generations to listen before speaking, the quiet spread of recognition may be the most meaningful response of all. This moment did not arrive to convince the inattentive. It came to alert those already paying attention, leaving behind a pause long enough for discernment to take root before whatever follows comes into view. Jerusalem confronts unusual and overlapping signals. Never before have the signals been so clear and so unsettling. Catastrophe arrives too swiftly, leaving no time for preparation. Many remain indifferent, taking it for granted. Yet the Bible reveals something different, a warning. This warning is not the end. There is no collapse, no final declaration, no single event that compels belief or demands immediate action. Instead, a harmony has formed. The individual elements, earth structure, sky system, and perception, have reacted briefly and then withdrawn. This is how beginnings often appear here, layered and easily missed by those expecting a spectacle. Warnings, when they come early, rarely create a sense of urgency for those not paying attention. They appear as interruptions rather than conclusions. The history of Jerusalem shows that moments like these are not meant to inspire fear, but to prepare. They create a window, a pause between normality and consequence, where discernment matters more than reaction. In that window, responsibility transfers quietly. The question is no longer whether something has begun. That threshold has been crossed. The question now is who is paying attention and how that attention is being exercised. Observation alone no longer suffices. The data have been gathered, the events have been recorded, the explanations have been offered and found insufficient. What remains is interpretation, guided not by panic, but by awareness. Discernment demands restraint. It resists rushing to conclusions while refusing to ignore the signs. It recognizes that consensus without chaos remains consensus, and that the silence following a signal does not erase its meaning. Jerusalem often enters crucial seasons in this way, not with fire or thunder, but with a subtle consensus among unrelated signals. This moment invites reflection rather than certainty. It asks whether we recognize the beginning when it goes unannounced, whether we notice the warnings that arrive gently, and whether we understand that preparation is often quieter than expected. The absence of immediate consequences does not mean irrelevance. It shows mercy, time granted before clarity becomes inevitable. For those familiar with the Bible, the necessary posture in such moments has been described. When these things begin to happen, lift up your heads. Luke 21, verse 28. The counsel is not to panic, but to stay alert, to look upward rather than turn away, and to remain watchful while time remains. When this chapter ends, nothing stands concluded. The city has not spoken the final word. Instead, space has been given space to observe carefully, to consider wisely, and to prepare mentally before the events shift from subtle to explicit. If you are following these developments closely, give the video a like, share your thoughts in the comments, subscribe to the channel, and thank you for staying with us as we continue. What are the chances that Jerusalem today would align with an ancient prophecy? It was not dramatic. It predicted no days, no specific words, no names. Instead, it described conditions, changes of refuge, small shifts that would seem ordinary to most people until they happened together. And that is what makes today different. The crowd shifted without seismic codes, forming a knot that defies all explanation. At the same time, the cameras were destroyed briefly. The lights flickered without loss of power, and the strong tones failed, moving through the stone rather than the air. As the shifts accumulated, the city itself seemed to respond. The voices lowered, the movement slowed. And among those familiar with the scriptures, recognition arose separately. At first glance, each detail could be explained, yet prophecy, according to the scriptures, rarely announces itself with thunder. It reveals itself through alignment. And when alignment appears, the question is no longer whether something is happening, but whether we are paying attention. If something is stirring in your heart at this moment, share your thoughts, give this video a like, and pay attention before continuing. Jerusalem lay quiet in the hours before dawn. The streets stood almost empty. The stone buildings, unchanged for centuries, held the cool air of night. The lights glowed softly in the windows. A city accustomed to prayer, to tension, and to history rested in a familiar stillness. Nothing suggested urgency, nothing hinted at danger. There were no sirens, no crowds, no warnings issued. At that hour, Jerusalem looked as it always had, ancient, firm, immovable. But beneath the stone, something had already begun out of place. It did not arrive with noise or force. There was no shaking of the ground. There was no sudden collapse. Instead, subtle changes began to appear in places people passed every day. The pavement settled by mere millimeters, fractures the thickness of a hair, traced lines across ancient stone, too straight, too clean to feel random. Most would not notice them at all. A maintenance worker paused longer than usual. A security camera captured a frame that did not quite match the one before it. A sensor recorded a reading that triggered no alarms, yet did not belong. Each detail on its own meant nothing. Jerusalem has always carried scars. Cracks are expected. Repairs are routine. The city has learned how to absorb damage and move forward. And that was the problem, because what was happening did not seem like damage. It seemed like pressure, slow, deliberate, and rising from within. And while the city slept unaware, the first signals had already taken their place. The first disturbance did not come from the sky. There was no storm. There was no wave of heat. There was no external force pressing upon the city. What unsettled Jerusalem that morning came from below, silently, constantly. In several locations, the ground changed just enough to be noticed by those working closest to it. The stone slabs sat lower than they had the day before. A narrow space opened along the edge of an ancient road, its line unusually straight, as though drawn rather than torn. There was no seismic activity to explain it. There was no nearby underground construction. There was no water pressure from above. Engineers expected crumbled stone, loose soil, irregular disruptions. Instead, they found something cleaner, more contained. The inner surfaces of the fractures were smooth. Rainwater, when it touched them, did not cloud immediately with sediment. It ran briefly clear in observation that caused several responders to pause longer than planned. Still, no alarms were raised. Jerusalem is a city built upon layers, ancient tunnels, forgotten foundations, centuries of human labor stacked beneath centuries of faith. Small movements are not unheard of. Explanations were offered, notes were taken, temporary barriers were placed. Life continued. But as the hours passed, similar disturbances appeared in other places, not connected by street, not bound to a single structure, spread across areas that shared no modern infrastructure, and yet displayed the same behavior: no collapse, no erosion release. What unsettled those who noticed was not the scale, but the direction. The pressure was not pushing inward. The outer world was moving upward. And for the first time, a quiet thought began to surface among those watching closely. This was not damage being done to the city. It was something beneath the city beginning to respond. By midday, the disturbances could no longer be treated as isolated. Reports arrived from different neighborhoods of the city areas, separated by walls, elevation, and purpose. What connected them was not location, but behavior. The ground did not fail violently. It changed with restraint, as though releasing pressure long held in place. Surveyors compared notes and found no single line to trace. The fissures did not follow known faults. They ignored modern construction grids. In several cases, they cut through older stonework in ways that defied structural expectation, straight where they should have curved, shallow where collapse would normally deepen. What concerned the observers was the timing. These changes were not unfolding over weeks or months. They appeared within the same narrow window of hours, emerging independently, yet echoing one another. Each site told the same silent story. Still, official language remained cautious. Terms such as settlement aging infrastructure and localized instability were used. But among those standing over the fissures, the explanations felt weak. There were no precursor signs, no gradual sinking, no surface tension that would normally warn of failure. The city had not been stressed by unusual weather. There was no external trigger strong enough to explain the synchronization. An engineer, after checking the same readings twice, noticed something unexpected. The instruments showed release without rupture. The pressure had moved, but without the violence that usually accompanies it. That detail changed the conversation because pressure released without breaking is not accidental. It is controlled. And once that realization settled, the disturbances stopped seeming like failures. They began to resemble signals not loud, not meant to alarm, but precise enough for anyone watching closely to recognize them as intentional. While attention remained fixed on the ground, other irregularities emerged quietly. In several areas near the previous disturbances, security cameras recorded brief visual distortions. Frames warped for a fraction of a second. Straight lines bent light intensified and collapsed without a clear source. Technicians marked the footage as interference, yet the equipment passed diagnostics before and after each incident. Almost at the same time, residents reported unusual sounds, no explosions, no mechanical noise. Low sustained tones were felt more than heard described as pressure moving through stone rather than air. In some cases, the sound appeared briefly, then faded without trace in standard audio records. Lighting behaved strangely as well. Street lamps flickered once, not repeatedly. Interior lights dimmed and returned without power loss. Witnesses described reflections along stone walls that seemed sharper than they should have been, as though the surface itself had changed how it carried light. Each report taken alone was not remarkable. Cameras fail. Sounds travel unpredictably in ancient cities. Electrical systems fluctuate. Jerusalem has explanations for all of this, but time has a way of exposing weakness in explanations. These irregularities appeared within the same hours, near the same zones, in proximity to the same underground changes, different systems ground. Light, sound, image responding independently, yet synchronizing in effect. Pause. There is when coincidence stops feeling comfortable because unrelated systems do not align without cause, and the cause did not come from above. There was no storm interrupting signals. There was no atmospheric event bending light. There was no regional power instability. The city above stood calm, predictable, controlled. Whatever was influencing these systems was working upward, touching stone, then structure, then perception. And that realization unsettled those paying attention, not because something dramatic had happened, but because too many small things were agreeing with one another. And agreement in a city like Jerusalem has never been accidental. Jerusalem did not enter panic. There were no mass evacuations. There were no headlines screaming disaster. The city did what it has always done. It absorbed the moment in silence. Workers lowered their voices. Security personnel lingered longer at checkpoints. Conversations that normally moved quickly began to halt, falling mid-sentence. People stood still more often than usual, as though listening for something they could not name. Some looked down at the stone beneath their feet, others looked up. Those who had lived in the city long enough felt the change first. Not fear, something older, a recognition that Jerusalem carries a different weight than other places. When things change here, they rarely do so without meaning. In certain neighborhoods, small groups gathered without any plan. No announcements were made. No one called a meeting. People simply stopped walking and remained where they stood. Some spoke in low voices. Others said nothing at all. And then came the words that altered the tone, not spoken aloud, not broadcast, only whispered. This was written. No chapter was cited. No verse was quoted. There was no sermon. Only a shared understanding among those familiar with the scriptures that warnings do not always arrive with spectacle. Often they reveal themselves through alignment. Some recalled a little-known text recorded decades ago, long before the technology of today, long before these systems existed. It described no collapse. It predicted no destruction. Instead, it spoke of conditions, a city responding from within, subtle signals rising before something visible followed. For years it had meant little. Now standing on ground that had moved without breaking, seeing light bend, without reason, hearing sounds that left no trace, its words felt uncomfortably present. Jerusalem had not shouted. It had responded. And for those who recognized the pattern, the realization was sober. This was not the event itself. It was the city acknowledging that something had begun. What was unfolding in Jerusalem was not a prediction coming true in the way many imagine prophecy. There was no marked date. There was no headline event announced in advance. There was no single moment that demanded immediate belief because biblical prophecy was never designed to function like a forecast. It works through alignment. The scriptures do not always state what will happen first. They describe what will exist together when the time draws near. Conditions, patterns, responses. The city moving without collapse. Systems reacting without external cause. People sensing meaning before evidence required it. None of these signals on their own demands a spiritual explanation. That is precisely the point. Prophecy reveals itself not when one thing happens, but when many unrelated things begin to agree. And agreement is what defined this moment. Decades ago, a warning was written that spoke of Jerusalem not crumbling, but stirring of subtle signals emerging from within the city before something visible followed of a period when discernment would matter more than observation. It named no hour. It described no technology. It simply described the state the city would enter. That state is now recognizable not because something dramatic has already occurred, but because the conditions match. And when alignment appears, the scriptures teach that responsibility shifts not to panic, not to proclaim certainty, but to remain awake. Jerusalem has always been a place where meaning precedes manifestation, where signals appear silently before they are understood publicly, where warning arrives gently, long before consequence arrives loudly. This moment does not demand belief. It demands attention because alignment once recognized is never accidental and never the end. A sudden and devastating catastrophe has just struck Jerusalem, unleashing destruction with a force no one expected. Yet what followed proved even more unsettling. A rapid sequence of inexplicable phenomena erupted across all of Israel. Ancient cameras cracking beneath the Judean desert. Mysterious lights appearing inside sacred sanctuaries. Strange activity rising from the waters of the Mediterranean. And rivers and skies behaving in ways scientists cannot explain. While the world watches in disbelief, one question grows louder. What if these events are not random at all, but signals pointing toward a moment foretold long ago? Stay with us. What you are about to see may reshape the way you understand the time we have now entered. Before we begin, please give the video a like, comment, and subscribe to support this channel. No one in Jerusalem will forget the moment the sky changed. What began as an ordinary afternoon above the ancient city shifted with terrifying speed into an event that defied every forecast, every scientific model, and every human explanation. Witnesses say the air grew unnaturally still, a disquieting silence that felt less like weather and more like a warning. Birds halted mid-flight, dogs began to whimper. Even the breeze seemed to withdraw from the hills surrounding the holy city. Then, without a single rumble of thunder, the heavens opened. A deluge of massive hailstones, irregular and unnaturally bright, began to plunge downward with a violence that felt almost deliberate. These were not the familiar rounded pellets of a winter storm. The stones were sharp, fragmented like pieces torn from some celestial forge, crashing onto roofs, ancient stone streets, and terraces that had stood firm for centuries. In mere seconds, the noise swelled to deafening levels, like thousands of hammer blows striking the city at once. The old city took the hardest strike. Along the paths winding toward the Temple Mount, century-old stones cracked under the force. On the Mount of Olives, the damage proved even more heartbreaking. Olive trees that had withstood wars, droughts, and empires snapped like fragile branches beneath the icy assault. Several trees believed to rank among the oldest living witnesses to Jerusalem's history split in two, as though severed by an invisible blade. A groundskeeper, trembling as he spoke, said, "These trees have outlasted nations, yet in 7 minutes they were broken." Across Jerusalem, the freezing barrage hammered everything in its path. Roof tiles shattered, balconies collapsed, windows exploded outward as though driven by an internal shock wave. Parked vehicles along narrow streets were dented and crushed in patterns meteorologists later described as consistent with debris falling from extreme altitude. Yet no aircraft had been recorded, no explosion, no meteor in the region. The hailstorm lasted 7 minutes. That brief span proved enough to mark the city in ways emergency workers say would normally require an earthquake. But the physical destruction formed only part of the mystery. During the hailstorm, Jerusalem's electrical grid flickered violently. Positioning devices failed. Phone signals dropped. Security cameras across multiple districts recorded bursts of unexplained static precisely when the largest hailstones struck the ground. Pilots flying over the region reported sudden magnetospheric interference, a phenomenon associated with solar storms. Yet none had been detected. Veterinarians throughout the city received dozens of reports of animals panicking moments before impact, as though reacting to something inaudible to human ears. When meteorologists reviewed the data, they found something even harder to explain. The atmospheric pattern that produced the storm matched no known meteorological behavior in the Middle East. There had been no preceding temperature drop, no storm front, no shift in humidity, nothing that should have supported hail formation, much less hail of this size and intensity. One researcher stated bluntly, this storm formed out of nothing. It appeared fully developed above Jerusalem, as though flipped on by a switch. That phrase spread quickly among religious communities. In synagogues and churches alike, leaders began to reference biblical accounts of sudden judgments, events where the very skies themselves transformed into instruments of divine communication. The parallels proved impossible to overlook. In Exodus, hail fell upon Egypt as a signal of divine displeasure. In Joshua, stones of hail struck the enemies of Israel with remarkable precision. In Job, the hail appeared described as stored for seasons of tribulation. Massive hail emerges as a portent in the final trembling of the earth. In Jerusalem, many felt the weight of those verses while they walked amid the destruction. It was not merely the severity of the storm. It was the unnatural precision, the sudden onset, and the unmistakable sense that the event carried profound meaning. 7 minutes reshaped the city. Yet what followed, the strange discoveries, the impossible phenomena, and the signals echoing across the land, suggested that the storm was not the end, but rather the beginning. A signal, a warning, a threshold moment where the natural and the supernatural touched the earth at once, and Jerusalem stood at the very center of it all. While meteorologists and physicists sought to classify the Jerusalem event, another group reached conclusions far more swiftly. Religious historians and prophetic scholars recognized a familiar structure, an ancient pattern described through centuries of sacred writings. They perceived no mere atmospheric anomaly. The initial clue lay within the hailstones themselves. Forensic teams determined that these were unlike typical layered ice. Each stone possessed a crystalline core with sharp needles radiating outward, almost like fragments of carved glass. Their density greatly exceeded normal hail, and many displayed geometric fractures that seemed intentionally formed rather than naturally deformed. Several field responders also noted something unexpected. The hail carried a faint metallic scent, blended with an herbal fragrance and aroma that defied identification and differed from any product of atmospheric chemistry. One engineer conceded that these could not have formed under standard atmospheric conditions. The storm's behavior deepened the enigma. Satellite models showed that the storm cell tightened as it approached Jerusalem, focusing upon the ancient city rather than dispersing over the surrounding terrain. The hills, valleys, and plains beyond Jerusalem sustained minimal impact, while narrow corridors of ancient streets absorbed the full force of the tempest. Scientists labeled this inexplicable. Theologians called it recognizable. In Jewish and Christian writings, hail seldom manifests as accidental weather. It arrives during pivotal moments when nations cross moral thresholds or when warnings go unheeded. Hail within this symbolic framework comes with clear purpose. Thus, many rabbis privately revisited older commentaries. One portrayed the hail as the cold rebuke that descends when pride burns unchecked. Another spoke of unusual storms that arise when the earth groans beneath ignored warnings. Christian scholars observed that the New Testament connects extraordinary hail to spiritual upheaval moments when heavenly and earthly realms react in unison. Revelation portrays hail as an indication that something within the invisible world has shifted. Many who examined the Jerusalem event believed precisely that a shift had taken place. The most intriguing analysis emerged from specialists in biblical geography. When they mapped the damage zones, they discovered that the storm's path linked locations tied to covenant promises and prophetic judgments from ancient eras. The concentration of destruction along these routes suggested not randomness, but alignment with history rather than with weather patterns. The international reaction mirrored this tension. Some dismissed the alignment as coincidence. Others sensed that the precision was too striking to overlook. A few analysts proposed that the storm had responded to spiritual geography, an idea rejected by science, yet deeply rooted in ancient belief. Meanwhile, residents of Jerusalem reported sensations they had felt moments before the storm: a heaviness in the air, the feeling of something invisible drawing near, or a pressure that seemed to hover above the rooftops. These impressions remained subjective, yet widespread. The event had not only shattered stone, it had awakened awareness. Media coverage heightened the global unease. Headlines framed the storm as unprecedented, unnatural, or even symbolic. Beneath every comment lay one growing question. If Jerusalem had entered a prophetic cycle, what now awaited beyond the first signal? The storm was the beginning. Even as emergency teams in Jerusalem labored tirelessly to clear the streets and restore order, a second, more silent event unfolded far from the clamor of the city. An event that would soon eclipse the hailstorm in mystery. It occurred in the arid expanses of the Judean desert, a region where the land conceals secrets far older than any kingdom still standing today. What emerged there was not destruction, but revelation. A minor tremor barely noticeable in Jerusalem traveled beneath the desert and fractured a rocky outcrop near an archaeological zone monitored by the Israel Antiquities Authority. Patrol teams dispatched to inspect the site uncovered something astonishing. A large fissure had opened in the ground, wide enough for a beam of light to penetrate deep below. When an investigator lowered a camera into the space, its descent revealed the unmistakable geometry of worked stone. It was a sealed chamber, forgotten and untouched for what seemed centuries. Within hours, a specialized excavation team arrived, clearing debris until the chamber's entrance lay exposed. The air that escaped felt cold, dry, and ancient, as if it had not circulated since the days when prophets still walked the earth. Lights lowered inside illuminated a rectangular room, Meticulously carved from limestone, its walls etched with inscriptions darkened by age and mineral dust. Yet the centerpiece of the discovery dominated all else, a stone sarcophagus positioned in the middle of the chamber. Its lid bore a thin crack, running diagonally across the top, as if someone or something had once attempted to force it open. Around the sarcophagus lay several skeletal remains positioned in an unusual manner. They were not scattered or collapsed, but deliberately arranged. Each skeleton knelt, facing the sarcophagus. Each one gripped a rusted sword with the blade pointed inward. The posture left no doubt they had perished in the act of guarding whatever the sarcophagus contained. The archaeologists remained silent for several minutes before speaking. The find differed from any known burial practice in Judea. Warriors interred alive to protect a tomb did not feature in Israelite tradition. One historian whispered, "This is no burial chamber, but rather a containment chamber." But the strangest detail involved not the skeletons, but the light. Throughout the day, a column of sunlight fell directly upon the sarcophagus. Even as shadows within the chamber shifted, the beam passed through the fissure above, striking the stone at nearly the same angle regardless of the hour. Astronomers were summoned to determine whether the light axis aligned with a specific solar position or seasonal event. Yet early calculations suggested something far stranger. The chamber's architecture had been engineered to capture sunlight in a manner that modern computations could not fully explain. This precision pointed to intention, to purpose. Jewish and Christian scholars later compared this occurrence to prophetic symbolism found in the scriptures. "Arise, shine, for your light has come." Isaiah chapter 60, verse 1. There is nothing hidden that will not be revealed. The souls beneath the altar, they cried out, Revelation chapter 6, verse 9. The parallels ignited debate at once. What event, what prophecy, or what secret could prove momentous enough to warrant a sealed chamber guarded by warriors who perished in kneeling postures? And why would such a structure yield its secrets now, mere days after an impossible storm had assailed Jerusalem? Rumors spread with startling speed. Some maintained the sarcophagus held sacred writings shielded through the chaos of war. Others speculated that within it rested the remains of a pivotal historical figure, one whose identity had been deliberately erased from official records, for reasons only now beginning to resonate with clarity. Still others whispered of forbidden artifacts, objects referenced in apocryphal texts, yet never verified by modern archaeology. The chamber offered no immediate answers, only questions that multiplied with every passing hour. Experts who entered the space noticed something even more unsettling. The inscriptions upon the walls defied any conventional script. Some appeared in ancient Hebrew, others in Aramaic, but certain symbols matched no known alphabet from the region. A linguist who studied the markings observed that they resembled warnings rather than epitaphs. The phrases he could decipher spoke of sealing of eternal vigilance of something that must not be released until the appointed time arrived. Yet what time, and appointed by whom? The presence of the kneeling warriors added a layer of unease no scientific analysis could fully dispel. Their bones displayed signs of violent death, but not from external combat. The fractures in skulls and ribs suggested they had been struck from within the chamber, not from without, as though something had attempted to break free, and they had sacrificed their lives to contain it. The rusted sword still pointed toward the center, toward the sarcophagus, as if even in death that they continued to fulfill their final command. One of the archaeologists, a man who had spent decades excavating ancient sites across Israel, confessed to profound disturbance. In all my expeditions, I have never encountered anything like this. This is no place of honor, but rather one of absolute containment. Whatever resides here, someone went to every length to ensure it remained imprisoned. While the teams debated how to proceed, the decision was made not to open the sarcophagus at once. The crack in the lid proved sufficiently alarming. It had formed from inside, not from outside. The pressure that caused that fracture had risen from below, as if something had pressed against the stone for centuries until it finally yielded in part. Yet whatever lay within had not managed to escape entirely. Not yet. Israeli authorities placed the site under permanent watch. High-definition cameras were installed, seismic sensors were deployed to detect any further movement, and a security perimeter was established that kept curious onlookers and media at a prudent distance. Nevertheless, word of the discovery leaked swiftly. Within days, the entire world knew that something extraordinary had been unearthed in the Judean desert. Social networks erupted with theories. Some asserted it was the Ark of the Covenant. Others insisted it was the tomb of a fallen angel. A few linked the find to prophecies concerning the end of days, proposing that the opening of this chamber signaled the start of a sequence foretold across millennia. Skeptics on their part argued that everything could be explained through conventional archaeology, and that the alignments with recent events in Jerusalem were precisely that coincidences. But the coincidences kept accumulating. 3 days after the chamber was discovered, strange phenomena began to be reported in areas nearby. Bedouin shepherds who had dwelt in the desert for generations spoke of lights appearing in the night sky, not stars nor aircraft, but luminosities that moved with clear intent, tracing geometric patterns before fading away. Animals in the vicinity displayed erratic behavior. Goats and camels refused to approach certain zones, retreating with evident fear when their owners tried to lead them in that direction. A team of researchers who spent the night near the site described unsettling experiences. Several recounted vivid, disturbing dreams, all sharing similar themes, visions of ancient battles, of radiant figures descending from the heavens, of a deep voice, resonating in a language they could not comprehend, yet somehow understood. One of them, a geologist with no particular religious leanings, awoke screaming in the middle of the night, swearing he had seen bright eyes watching him from the desert darkness. These accounts were at first dismissed as the result of stress, sleep deprivation, or collective suggestion. But when the security team monitoring the site started to report identical experiences, the authorities were compelled to take the matter seriously. Backup crews were dispatched, psychological evaluations were conducted, ventilation systems were examined for possible contaminants that might induce hallucinations. Everything checked out as normal. What was not normal was what the security cameras had recorded. On several occasions during the darkest hours of the night, the footage revealed visual anomalies inside the chamber shadows that shifted without any light source to cause them distortions in the air around the sarcophagus, like waves of heat, though the temperature inside remained steady and cold. And on one occasion, for exactly 3 seconds, the cameras captured what appeared to be a humanoid figure standing beside the sarcophagus, enveloped in what could only be described as pulsing light, before it vanished instantly. Technicians examined the equipment with exhaustive care. They found no faults. The recordings were genuine. Whatever the cameras had captured had truly been there, if only for an impossibly brief moment. While this unfolded in the desert, Jerusalem itself continued to experience inexplicable manifestations. The fissures on the Mount of Olives that had remained stable for days suddenly widened slightly one night, with no seismic activity recorded at all. Nearby residents reported hearing sounds they described as deep groans rising from the earth, as though the ground itself were voicing something human words could not capture. In the temple area, where centuries of religious conflict had turned every stone into a contested symbol, something occurred that defied all sectarian divisions. Both Orthodox Jews and devout Muslims reported similar experiences during their respective times of prayer. They described an overwhelming presence, not threatening, yet immensely powerful, that filled the sacred space with an intensity that made breathing difficult. Some wept without knowing why. Others stood motionless, unable to finish their prayers, overwhelmed by a sense of reverence that transcended their own traditions. An imam who had served at the mosque for 20 years admitted, "I have prayed here thousands of times. Yet never have I felt anything like this. It was as though the veil between the visible and the invisible had grown transparent, as if for a moment we could perceive what has always been there, but which we normally cannot see. A rabbi offered a similar reflection. Our texts speak of moments when the divine presence becomes palpable in the physical world. I always thought they were poetic metaphors. Now, I am not so certain. What we are experiencing goes beyond the religious language we use to describe it. These convergences of experience among communities, normally divided by theology and politics, added yet another dimension to the mystery. Whatever was unfolding there did not. It respected human categories. It made no distinction between Jew and Muslim, between believer and skeptic, between religious and secular. It touched everyone, even if each interpreted it through their own frame of reference. On the outskirts of the city, in areas less watched by media and authorities, even stranger accounts began to emerge. Families living in small settlements spoke of nocturnal visitors, figures that appeared in their fields or gardens always at dusk or dawn. Never in full daylight, nor in complete darkness, these figures did not speak, they simply observed. And those who saw them described a sensation of being evaluated, as though these presences were measuring something, determining whether humanity stood ready for what lay ahead. An elder who had spent his entire life in the hills of Judea shared his encounter with a journalist who still clung to skepticism. I saw 3 of them standing in my olive grove. They were tall, taller than any man I have ever known. They glowed not with artificial light, but with something that seemed to emanate from within them. They looked at me, and in that instant, I felt my whole life pass before me, every decision, every word, every action. They said nothing, yet I knew what they were doing. They were measuring, and when they finished, they simply vanished like smoke in the wind. The journalist published the story expecting it to be dismissed as the fantasy of an old man. Instead, he received dozens of messages from other readers, many of them young urban professionals who described nearly identical encounters. The pattern proved too consistent to ignore, yet too extraordinary to be easily accepted by established institutions. Meanwhile, in academic institutions across the world, biblical scholars and students of ancient texts began to revisit prophecies that had long been relegated to the margins of serious interpretation. Passages that spoke of signs in the heavens and on the earth, of fissures in sacred places, of discoveries that would unveil secrets long concealed, of a time when the supernatural would manifest undeniably in the natural world. A professor of biblical studies at an American university published an article that quickly went viral. In it, he argued that what was unfolding in Jerusalem and its surroundings were not isolated events, but part of a coherent prophetic sequence documented in ancient writings, yet seldom taken literally. He cited passages from Daniel, Ezekiel, Zechariah, and Revelation showing how current occurrences resonated with descriptions that for centuries had been viewed as purely symbolic. What our ancestors recorded, he contended, were not vague metaphors about abstract spiritual struggles, but literal accounts of physical events that would take place when certain conditions were met. The issue was not that the prophecies lacked precision, and the issue was that we, with our modern mindset, refused to take them seriously as descriptions of concrete future realities. His article sparked intense debate. Conservative academics accused him of sensationalism. Yet even some of his harshest critics admitted in private that the parallels between the ancient texts and present events were specific enough to warrant serious consideration, even if that consideration unsettled them deeply. In Israel, the government faced a unique dilemma. On one hand, it bore the duty to preserve public order and prevent panic. On the other, it could not deny what was happening in plain sight. The events in Jerusalem were not rumors or urban legends. They were being captured by cameras measured by scientific instruments, witnessed by thousands of people from every nationality and background. An emergency meeting was convened that included not only government officials, but also religious leaders from the main traditions, prominent scientists, and security experts. The goal was to craft a coordinated response that acknowledged the reality of what was occurring without fueling hysteria or sectarian conflict. The Prime Minister opened the session with a startling admission. We are confronting something for which none of us in our training or experience was prepared to manage. I cannot stand before the people of Israel and claim that all this has normal explanations when clearly it does not. Nor can I tell them that I know what it means or what comes next, because I do not. What I can say is that we must navigate this together with honesty, with humility, and with the understanding that we are treading ground where science, faith, and history intersect in ways that challenge our usual categories. One of the scientists, present a renowned theoretical physicist, replied with words few expected from someone of his secular background. Throughout my career, I have operated under the assumption that the universe functions according to consistent and predictable natural laws. And I still believe that. Yet what we are witnessing here suggests that our grasp of those laws remains incomplete. There are layers of reality that our current science cannot measure or explain. That does not mean we should abandon the scientific method. It means we must recognize its present limits while striving to expand them. A chief rabbi added, our traditions have always taught that a time would come when the heavens and the earth would no longer operate according to the patterns we have grown accustomed to, a time of transition between one era and another. The texts call it the birth pangs of a new reality. They are not the end. Then they are the beginning of something that transcends our current expectations. A Muslim leader offered a complementary perspective. In our sacred writings, we are told of signs that will precede the day of judgment, not to instill fear, but to awaken humanity from its complacency. These signs serve a purpose to remind us that reality is vaster and more meaningful than our daily lives allow us to perceive. What is happening calls us to rise, to become better, to prepare for a transformation we had forgotten was always part of the divine plan. The meeting concluded with an agreement to establish a special committee that would include voices from all these different fields, an unprecedented recognition that the challenges they faced demanded wisdom. No single discipline or tradition could provide alone. While these official developments took shape, everyday life in Jerusalem began to shift in subtle yet profound ways. People walked more slowly through the streets, as though each step required greater consideration. Conversations in cafes and markets turned less toward politics and economy, and more toward questions of meaning, purpose, and preparation. There was a collective sense that time was accelerating toward some culminating point, though no one knew exactly what form that point would assume. In schools, teachers noticed that children were asking questions earlier generations seldom posed at such a young age. What happens when the world changes in ways we cannot control? How do we know if we are ready for something new? What does it mean to be brave when the unknown becomes known? These questions arising from young minds, not yet hardened by cynicism or rigid certainties, offered a window into how future generations might navigate what lay ahead. Hospitals reported a curious phenomenon. Patients with terminal illnesses, people who had endured months or years of pain and despair, began to speak of unexpected peace. Some described visions of light and comforting figures that visited them in their rooms at night. Others simply expressed an inexplicable certainty that death was not the end they had feared, but a transition to something they could now perceive waiting for them. Medical staff trained to maintain professional distance admitted they were deeply moved by these transformations in their patients. A nurse shared her observations after 15 years in palliative care. I have witnessed people facing death in many ways, some with faith, others with terror, most with a mixture of both. Yet what I am seeing now feels entirely different. It is as though they know something the rest of us have not yet grasped, as if they can see something just beyond the veil that we still cannot perceive. In the prisons, guards reported striking shifts in inmate behavior. Men long known for violence and hostility grew contemplative, spending hours in silence, some weeping without apparent cause. others seeking out religious texts they had never shown interest in before. When asked what had changed, many struggled to express it, saying things like, "Something is ending," or "I can feel a door opening," or "I can no longer pretend my life holds no meaning." These personal transformations, multiplied by thousands across the region, created an atmosphere difficult to convey to those not present. It was not panic yet, neither was it calm. It felt more like active anticipation, a collective sense of standing at the threshold of something monumental. Meanwhile, in scientific institutions around the world, extraordinary efforts unfolded to explain the occurrences through natural models. Theories emerged around unusual geomagnetic activity, macroscopic quantum effects, and rare atmospheric phenomena. Each carried elements of plausibility, yet none accounted for the complete pattern. The events were not consistent enough to be purely physical, nor random enough to lack significance. A group of theoretical physicists published a speculative paper that drew considerable attention. They proposed that what was being observed might represent evidence of intersections between dimensions or parallel realities, moments when the barrier between different planes of existence grew permeable. They acknowledged this as pure speculation, yet argued it could explain how events impossible under known physical laws occurred not by violating those laws, but by operating according to principles of a more complete physics we had yet to comprehend. Imagine, they wrote, that our three-dimensional reality resembles a sheet of paper floating within a far vaster, multidimensional space. Most of the time, we experience only our sheet, but under certain conditions at certain moments, that sheet may touch or overlap with other realities, other dimensions. What we term miracles or supernatural phenomena could simply be instances when such overlap takes place, and the rules of other dimensions temporarily influence our own. It was a daring theory, and many colleagues criticized it as overly speculative. Still, it resonated with a surprising number of people because it allowed a scientific framework while acknowledging that reality proved far more complex than conventional models permitted. Amid all these intellectual and spiritual developments, the desert chamber remained sealed, the sarcophagus unopened. Yet the decision to wait could not hold indefinitely. Public pressure to reveal its contents grew daily. Media outlets from across the globe kept correspondents stationed near the site. Social networks surged with increasingly elaborate theories. Then on the 14th night after the discovery, something occurred that compelled the authorities to act. Seismic sensors surrounding the chamber registered a disturbance. It was not an earthquake in the conventional sense. It resembled more a pulse, a rhythmic vibration emanating directly from the sarcophagus itself. The cameras captured the instant when the crack in the lid, which had remained stable since discovery, suddenly widened by several centimeters. There was no sound of stone fracturing. It simply expanded, as though something within pressed upward with growing insistence. The security team on site contacted their superiors immediately. Within 2 hours, a full specialist team was en route. But before they arrived, the cameras recorded something more. Light began to filter through the widened crack. It was neither torchlight nor electric illumination. It was light that pulsed in sync with the vibration the sensors detected, as if the source of the light and the source of the vibration were one and the same. With each pulse, the intensity increased. Following emergency protocols, the security guards evacuated the immediate area. From a safe distance, they watched as the light emerging from the sarcophagus grew ever brighter until the entire chamber glowed as though it were midday. Though outside, it remained the middle of the night. Then, as abruptly as it had begun, everything ceased. The light faded and the vibration stopped, and silence returned. When the specialist team finally arrived and conducted an inspection, they discovered that something fundamental had changed. The skeletons of the guardian warriors, which had remained in their kneeling posture for centuries, now lay flat upon the floor. They had not been moved by physical force. The cameras would have captured that. They simply rested in new positions as though they had at last fulfilled their duty and could now rest. Their swords no longer pointed toward the sarcophagus, but lay beside the bodies parallel to the ground without threat in their orientation. Even more astonishing, the inscriptions on the walls that had remained partially obscured by centuries of mineral buildup now stood completely visible and clear. It was as though something had cleansed them from within, revealing messages that had awaited this precise moment to be read. Linguists hurried to translate what they could now see with clarity. The message proved brief yet powerful. When the earth trembles and the sky speaks, when what was sealed has been revealed and the guardians rest, then the time of waiting shall be fulfilled. What lies within will no longer remain hidden. The witness shall be released to speak of what was and what will be. The implications stood clear. The sarcophagus must be opened not as an act of human curiosity, but as the fulfillment of a plan established millennia ago. The events in Jerusalem and the discovery of the chamber, the inexplicable phenomena, all had served as prelude to this moment. The decision was made. In 72 hours, with representatives from multiple governments, religious leaders from the principal traditions, and a select group of scientists and scholars present, the sarcophagus would be opened. The event would be broadcast live to the entire world because whatever it contained, its revelation concerned not only Israel, but all humanity. Those 72 hours were perhaps the most tense the modern world had experienced. Stock markets fluctuated wildly as investors attempted to anticipate what the discovery might mean for the future. Churches, synagogues, and mosques filled with people seeking spiritual guidance. Sales of religious texts soared as individuals who had never shown interest in ancient scriptures suddenly felt compelled to understand what the prophets had said about times such as these. In the streets of Jerusalem, the atmosphere felt almost surreal. Tourists who had arrived for the opening of the sarcophagus mingled with local residents. Journalists set up crews on every available corner. Pilgrims from every faith walked the ancient streets, many in silence, others praying aloud. There was no violence, there was no conflict. Instead, there existed a shared sense of participating in a pivotal hinge moment in human history. The night before the scheduled opening, something remarkable occurred throughout the city. And according to reports arriving from other parts of the world, people experienced similar dreams. They were not nightmares. They were visions of a book opening, pages turning, words forming themselves in languages the dreamers could not read, yet somehow understood. And a voice warm, yet infinitely powerful, declaring what has been sealed shall now be known. What has been hidden shall now be revealed. Prepare your hearts not with fear, but with hope, for the time of the great transition has arrived. Millions awoke simultaneously across different time zones, all sharing the same sensation of having received a personal message, even while it was delivered to all humanity. Social networks flooded with accounts of these dreams. Skeptics dismissed them as collective hysteria, triggered by relentless media coverage. But for those who experienced them, the authenticity of what they had perceived remained undeniable. At last, the moment arrived. The world paused. Estimates suggest more than 4 billion people watched the largest simultaneous broadcast event in human history. Inside the desert chamber, beneath portable lights installed for the occasion, a team of experts prepared to lift the lid of the sarcophagus. The team leader, a world-renowned Israeli archaeologist, addressed the cameras briefly. What we are about to do is something the builders of this chamber planned more than 2,000 years ago. They left us instructions, warnings, and blessings. We proceed not with pride, but with humility, not as conquerors of the past, but as recipients of a message that has awaited its proper time to be delivered. With extreme care, using specialized equipment to distribute the weight evenly, the team began to raise the stone lid. It was incredibly heavy, requiring hydraulic machinery to move it, even with the assistance of many hands, centimeter by centimeter. The lid rose, the inner chamber of the sarcophagus revealed itself gradually. First, more stone appeared, then what seemed to be preserved fabric, and finally, when the lid had been fully removed and set carefully aside, the complete contents lay exposed. There were no human remains. Instead, there rested a cylinder of metal remarkably well preserved, with elaborate inscriptions covering its surface. The metal itself proved unusual. Later analysis would determine it was an alloy, matching no known technology from the era when the chamber was constructed. Beside the cylinder lay a second object, wrapped in linen of the highest quality, still intact after centuries. When the experts carefully unwrapped the fabric, they revealed a book, if it could be called that. It resembled more an ancient codex, with pages made of a material that was neither paper nor parchment, but something crystalline or glassy, translucent, yet with writing clearly visible on both sides of each page. The lead archaeologist, with hands trembling not from nervousness, but from reverence, lifted the cylinder. There was a circular seam near one end, suggesting it could be opened. With a careful turn, the seal broke after millennia. The cylinder opened, and from within emerged a scroll of material similar to that of the book. Yet this one was covered entirely with text. The silence within the chamber stood absolute. No one spoke. The world watched. Then one of the linguists stepped forward, examined the text, and visibly paled. "I can read it," he whispered. "It is in ancient Hebrew, but also in Aramaic, Greek, Latin, and other languages. It is as though it were written to be understood by anyone who found it, regardless of their era or tongue." And the text, his voice broke with emotion. "The text is addressed to us, to the people who would open it, in this exact time." With permission from his superiors, he began to read aloud, translating into modern English as he proceeded. "To the children of future time to whom this message is intended. If you are reading these words, then the seals have been broken, and the time of revelation has arrived. What you hold in your hands is not merely a record of the past, but a testament of the future that now begins to unfold. We, the scribes and guardians of this knowledge, were instructed by those who saw beyond the veil of time. We were told that an age would come when the heavens and the earth would no longer remain separated as they have been since the ancient days. We were told there would be signs. The earth would move without earthquake, the skies would speak without storm, and the hidden would be revealed without human hands seeking it. If these signs have manifested, then know this: what has for so long been divided shall soon reunite once more. The division between the material and the spiritual, between the seen and the unseen, between the earth and what lies beyond it, shall begin to dissolve not in destruction, but in transformation, not in ending, but in new beginning. The content of this vessel is a testimony. It is the record of what was promised in the ancient days and now begins to be fulfilled. It is also a warning. Do not fear what comes yet, neither treat it lightly. The transformation of the world is not for the unprepared, nor for the complacent. It is for those who have kept their hearts ready, their minds open, and their spirits attentive to the signs we have described. Read what follows with care. Share these words with all peoples, for what we have preserved belongs not to one nation or one faith, but to all humanity. And what comes will transform not only your understanding of the past, but your experience of the present, and your preparation for the future that even now begins to be born. The linguist paused his translation, overcome. In the chamber, tears flowed down the faces of several present, both believers and skeptics, because the message, regardless of how it might be interpreted, carried a weight of authenticity that transcended intellectual debate. What continued in the scroll and what the crystalline book contained would be studied intensively in the days and weeks ahead. Yet already in this first moment of revelation, the world had changed. The question was no longer whether something extraordinary was occurring. That question had been answered definitively. The question now was what it meant and how humanity would respond. In Jerusalem, as news of the discovery spread, People stepped into the streets, not in panic, but in contemplation. Spontaneous circles of discussion formed in public squares. Strangers spoke to one another with unusual openness, sharing hopes and fears, questions and convictions. A veteran journalist who had covered wars and conflicts for decades in this divided city sent this dispatch to his newspaper. I have seen Jerusalem in its darkest moments, torn by hatred and violence. Today I see it in a different moment. I cannot call it its finest hour because we do not yet know what it will bring. But it is a moment of unexpected unity, of shared purpose, of collective recognition that we all stand together on the threshold of something none of our old categories can fully contain. Whether this proves for good or for ill remains to be determined, but that it is real cannot be denied. And so, as the sun set over the holy city on that extraordinary day, Jerusalem and the world prepared for what would come next, knowing that the time of waiting had ended and the time of full revelation had only just begun.